Welcome to IFAB Online.
Welcome to IFAB Online.
Welcome to IFAB Online.
Welcome everyone to the tax and legal session for IFAB Online. This is where you get to know all the really exciting things that fundraisers are asked by donors about how much money they can save, or tax benefits or legal issues that they need to know. And so you need to know, because if you're working in another country, you may get asked the kinds of questions that we're going to talk about now. This is not a session for lawyers, even though it's being delivered by lawyers. It's for you as fundraisers to really understand what this is all about. We're concentrating on two different markets, the US and the UK, but we'll also mention some of the other markets around the world. I'm Nancy Bixon. I'm the Managing Director of Chaplin York. I'm also a lawyer, and I'm very thrilled to introduce Jane Peoples and James Maloney as your part of your speakers today. I'm going to give you a little bio of Jane and James, who will be speaking after me. Jane Peoples is a partner in the law firm of Carlin & Peoples, LLP, in Los Angeles, California. Her areas of legal practice are U.S. and international estate and charitable planning. She counsels high net worth individuals, family-owned businesses, nonprofit organizations, and philanthropists, has helped form, fund, and operate many charitable organizations, and facilitate numerous gifts for charitable projects in the U.S. and abroad. James Maloney is a partner at Farah & Co., a law firm in London. He advises charities, nonprofits to some of you in the world, and those who donate to or partner with them on compliance with English charitable law. This includes advice to UK charities working internationally, international charities working in the UK, and also philanthropists with interests in various countries. He is currently the Deputy Chair of STEP's Philanthropy Advisors Global SIG Steering Committee, and he also lectures on charity law and charity tax law at Cass Business School. So I'm going to turn over now to Jane Peoples to talk about the US and the external reach that it has, and how foreign organizations can fundraise in America and American entities fundraising abroad. So over to Jane, and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us from California, from sunny California.
Thank you, Nancy. I'm delighted to be speaking with all of you today. You will see I don't have handouts or slides, but anyone who wants the very long version of my presentation is welcome to contact me after or get to me through Nancy. So I'm going to walk you through some basic US tax rules that will impact how you do your fundraising here in the US. There are several different ways to do it, and I will try to help you understand why one or the other would be more appropriate for your foreign charitable organization or NGO. So like many other countries, the US offers charitable donors tax benefits, an income tax, charitable deduction. But we also have what I call a water's edge approach, which is, okay, American donor, if you give to a US charity, you get this benefit, but if you give directly to a foreign charity, you don't. Well, how then do you raise funds in the US, assuming that US donors to your nonprofit would also like a tax benefit in the home jurisdiction? So here are a few different ways that a foreign nonprofit can raise funds here. Since the American donor can't make a direct gift, there has to be some sort of entity which can take in the gift and then re-grant it for a program abroad or to a foreign charity. And the way we do this is we have a few different kinds of charitable organizations that can help with this. Some of them make a lot of sense and some of them don't. The first is what the US calls a public charity. A public charity is set up to raise funds from a broad spectrum of donors. It either has to have at least a third of its support from a broad base of donors, or it may be a public charity by virtue of its character. So universities, hospitals, museums, churches would fall into the public charity category as well. So that's number one, and we're going to circle back and talk about raising funds through all of these vehicles. The next is called a private foundation, and the most common type is set up by an individual or a family. It has no plans to raise funds from other donors, and it's subject to a lot of strict rules about what it has to do if it's making grants for use abroad. But many private foundations do make grants for use abroad. The next option, which is probably the best for your organization if you are not foreseeing a really material amount of donations from US donors. If you think, well, maybe in the first year we'll raise 100,000 or something around there, then it's expensive to set up your own public charity, and there are ongoing expenses for special tax reporting, etc. So for someone who's raising a lot of money, public charity might be the best vehicle. For an organization that is not yet at that stage, then you might want to use some sort of fiscal agent. And this would be an organization that is itself treated as a public charity, but your organization doesn't form it. You use its services. And these organizations can take in a donation so that you get a tax benefit in the home country, then can re-grant those funds abroad. So Chapel in York is a great example of a company that provides this service. We also have Charities Aid Foundation, which is here in the States and also in the UK. Asia Foundation is very useful for grants going out to Asian NGOs and nonprofits. And King Baudouin is another one that we have here in the States that specializes in gifts and grants within the EU. I should mention that there are also some funds that are dual qualified. James is going to talk more about those, but that would be, for example, an arrangement where a US resident living in the UK could make a charitable donation through this dual qualified fund and get both a UK tax credit and a US income tax charitable deduction. The last way to do this, and one that I have been discussing recently, is if you have one major donor, and it might be a one-off gift, what's the easiest way to structure that? And that might be for the donor to open what's called a donor advised fund here. That is a fund to which the donor makes grants. He gets tax benefits as though he had given to a public charity. And then at a later period, if not immediately, he has an advisory right to say to the organization that hosts this donor advised fund, I would like you to make a grant to XYZ foreign charity. You can't mandate it, but the fund will generally do it unless it's funding terrorism or something else that would be illegal. And that's no cost to your organization. The donor sets it up to make the gift through it and get her income tax benefit here. One of the interesting rules that we have here is that a public charity or any other organization raising funds from the public cannot take in a grant and say, these funds will be used for that project abroad. These funds will be granted to that charity in the UK for this specific project. Our taxing authority, the Internal Revenue Code, says if a fundraising organization of any sort here is raising funds and promising to send the funds abroad, it may treat it as though the US donor made the gift directly to the foreign charity, and so he loses the tax benefit. But what the charity can say is, we plan to send this money abroad, but if anything happens, if we think there's been diversion of funds, if the charitable mission of your organization strays from what supports our own charitable mission, then we retain discretion and control not to make this grant or to stop funding this project. And that discretion and control is key to getting the tax benefit here. Okay, what things are simple? So for a public charity, as I said, they need to be raising funds from a very broad base of donors. Private foundation has to be very careful when making grants abroad. The interest of our government is that it wants the grant to be used for charitable purposes that are recognized under our law, and different jurisdictions have different definitions of what's charitable. So if, let's say, a private foundation here wants to make a grant to your foreign NGO, it first needs to determine whether your organization is equivalent to our charitable beast, the public charity that has that broad base of support. If perhaps it's a museum, if it's a hospital, it may well be equivalent to a US public charity here. And if that's the case, the private foundation can make the grant. There should be a grant letter. It should look at your organization's governing documents. It probably, as best practice, should be getting reports back from you annually of how you use the funds and a narrative about how the project is going. If our private foundation can't conclude that your organization is equivalent to a US public charity, then it's got to do something called called Expenditure Responsibility, which is it makes a grant, but it keeps a very close eye on it. Not only is there a very high level of due diligence about your charity abroad, but there's also a lot of ongoing reporting back to the US private foundation that you will have to do. And so again, it's give us a budget and description of your project. Is it being funded all at once or in phases? Who are all your board members? We need to be sure they're not on the US list of terrorists and terrorist organizations. A whole series of questions. Your mission, are you involved in politics? If your organization ever is terminated, are all the funds required to go to another charitable organization? These kinds of questions will go sometimes quite deeply into detail on your organization. The requirements for how much the public charity has got to do really is going to depend on several things, but what they're trying to do also is assess the risk of diversion, money laundering, terrorist financing. If your charity is, say, the Louvre, we've got American Friends of the Louvre, it's clearly equivalent to a US public charity. If it is American Friends of the Sorbonne, same thing. But if it is a small grassroots organization in a rural area in sub-Saharan Africa, the process is going to be quite different. If your nonprofit is in an area that is politically unstable or war-torn, the process is going to be much different, much more due diligence. So let me mention quickly, I have only a few minutes left. It is possible for your foreign charity or NGO to apply to our Internal Revenue Service and get a ruling that says, if your organization had been created in the US, it would have qualified as a public charity. That does not mean that a US individual can make a gift to your charity and get a tax benefit, but it does mean that a private foundation can fund your charity without having to go through all of this due diligence and monitoring and reporting requirements. There is also no need to try to determine whether a government or governmental agency or a municipality is equivalent to a US public charity. They are deemed to be. So again, what to expect? The US donor is going to ask to see your governing documents and get them translated as need be. They're going to want to know what your charitable purpose and mission is, and then have to determine whether that furthers their own charitable mission. They need to know there's no private benefit. Only the funds can only be used for charitable purposes. And of course, there's overhead in any nonprofit. And then again, anti-terrorist financing, we have had, and I'm just going to mention this very briefly, there was quite a bit of controversy several years back when US nonprofits started putting into their grant letters for foreign charities that the charity had to declare that it would not use the funds to fund terrorists or terrorist organizations. And at first I thought that's ridiculous. Of course, the foreign charity is going to say, we're not terrorists. What are they going to say? We're terrorists, don't give us the money. I thought it was really rather silly. But then the large US foundations, Ford, etc., started doing this. And I think it's to just put that very much on the radar screen because the taxing authorities here scrutinize money laundering and terrorist funding very, very closely. And that's my quick roundup of US rules you should know about.
Thank you, Jane, so much for that really interesting comments. Can I just confirm that, because lots of times outside the US, people do hear about 501c3s. And can you put what a what the 501c3 means in America?
Absolutely. So a 501c3 is an organization that has applied to the IRS for tax exempt status as a charity, has received that status from the IRS. The IRS sends something we call a determination letter that says, yes, you're a charity. But 501c3 also encompasses public charities as well as private foundations set up typically by a family, as well as another beast I did not describe, which is a private operating foundation, which is like a private foundation, except it carries out its charitable projects abroad directly rather than sending funds to a foreign NGO.
Super. So that when you were talking about the public charities and all of that, that's a 501c3. And that's if somebody wanted to set up their own entity, that's what they would be looking to establish. Is that right?
That's exactly what they would be looking to establish. The cost to set one up, it varies, but in a major urban area like Los Angeles, you can assume 10 to 15,000 if there's going to be grant making for use abroad. And then there are ongoing costs for annual tax information returns, keeping track of grants and general operations.
Super. Thank you so much. That's so helpful. Can I now turn to James and please tell us about the UK and other bits of the world.
Thanks, Nancy, and thank you, Jane, for that really interesting session. In my part of today's session, I'm going to have a look at how the UK rules affect charities that raise and spend funds internationally. I'm going to run through the tax reliefs that are available here in the UK briefly, and then I'm going to have a look at how those rules affect non-UK donors and also overseas non-profits that want to raise funds in the UK. So there's quite a lot of different parts to this, and I hope you can stick with me. A little bit like Jane, I don't have a sort of formal slideshow. I do have one slide to explain our gift aid regime because that is quite complicated. But like Jane, I'd be very happy to share my notes from today. Now, the UK system does make it relatively simple for charities to raise and spend funds globally. UK charities can have non-UK board members and even a majority. And there are some similarities with the issues Jane has mentioned. We have donor advised funds as well, although we don't make the same distinction between public charities and private foundations. The UK is a well-recognised and strongly regulated jurisdiction through which to run a charity. And the upside of that is that you get the benefit of a UK registered charity, something that's transparent and well-respected. Anyone can look you up in a few seconds online. They can see your charity's accounts and who your trustees are. And that protects donors who work through UK charities, who know that they're publicly accountable. It also reassures funders and partner organisations. But the downside is that charity regulation isn't something we do lightly in the UK. Some countries leave this to their tax regulator, but not us. We have a whole range of regulators. We have the Charity Commission, which is the main regulator for charities in England and Wales. The Commission registers charities here and regulates them for legal purposes, although not all charities have to register. Charity law has devolved to the various national parliaments, so Scotland and Northern Ireland have their own regulators. We have Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, which regulates charities for tax purposes, and that's important in a fundraising context, of course, when we think about entitlements to UK tax reliefs. We have the fundraising regulator, which regulates charity fundraising. And we also have other regulators that might be relevant for your work, in particular the Information Commissioner for Data Protection. So if you're an overseas charity that wants to come to the UK, wants to raise funds from UK donors, what do you need to do? Well, the answer is you don't need to do very much beyond acting within the law. But there are almost certainly going to be registration requirements to think about if you want your organisation to benefit from UK tax reliefs for charities, which are very generous. And even then, unfortunately, the tax system doesn't, for the most part, recognise donations by donors who don't have UK source income. Now, before I have a look at cross-border giving and how that involves the UK system, I'm going to just touch on the various tax reliefs that are available to UK individuals and businesses that give to charities, because I think it's worth just mentioning those. You might or might not be familiar with them. Now, those include cash gifts by individuals, which go through something called our gift aid scheme, cash gifts by businesses, and then gifts of certain kinds of assets, such as land in the UK or certain kinds of investment. I mentioned that the UK system is quite an unusual one. Most countries that I'm familiar with give the benefit to the donor, but what we have in the UK is a sort of hybrid system. And what I mean by that is that there is a benefit to the receiving charity, if it's in the UK, and also for those donors who are higher or additional rate taxpayers here, to the donor as well. Now, I think Ireland has a similar system, but I think apart from that, it's pretty unique, certainly in European terms. I'm going to just explain a little bit about how this works, because, as I said, it does, I think, warrant some attention. So there are some conditions that you need to think about for any donation to be eligible for gift aid. And most of the difficult questions that arise with these are to do with the benefits that somebody making a gift can get in return. The basic rule, which probably won't surprise anybody and is familiar to a lot of jurisdictions, is that if a donor benefits significantly from their donation, that won't qualify for gift aid. A gift does need to be made by a UK taxpayer, but that isn't necessarily a UK citizen, and that taxpayer must pay enough tax to cover the value of the reclaim. Now, the effect of a gift aid donation from an individual is that it allows the charity receiving the donation to reclaim basic rate tax, which is 20% here on the gift. And if the donor is a higher rate 40% or additional rate 45% taxpayer, gift aid will also allow the donor to reclaim the difference between the basic and the higher or the additional rate of tax on their donations. Now, gift aid isn't only for individuals. There is a scheme for businesses, but the relief works in a different way. And here, the donations are deductible from the total profits of the business when calculating its corporation tax liability. There are special rules for companies that are owned by charities, but importantly, this way around, the charity doesn't have to make a repayment claim, because for a business donation, no tax has been paid. Now, I mentioned that I had a slide. I'm just going to show you some examples of how gift aid affects basic rate, higher rate and UK taxpayers, because I think it's worth just understanding this. So this shows that the system works slightly differently depending on the rate of tax that a UK payer pays. But I think what I hope it illustrates is just how advantageous the gift aid scheme can be, particularly where charities are dealing with higher or additional rate taxpayers. In my third example, the donation of £800 results in a benefit to the charity of £1,000, but a net cost to the donor of only £550. And I think that illustrates just what a powerful device gift aid can be in helping to maximise the value of a donation. As well as cash gifts through the gift aid scheme, donors can also make gifts of qualifying shares, land or buildings to a charity, and in doing so, the donors can claim relief from income tax and capital gains tax. Now, making a gift of an asset can be a better deal for a donor than selling an asset and gifting the proceeds through the gift aid scheme, but the benefit to your charity or non-profit may be lower this way round. So having explained a little bit about how tax reliefs for donors work here in the UK, what is the position for UK charities and non-profits that are seeking to raise funds internationally? I'm going to just look at this from a few different angles. So can only UK citizens donate? No, anyone can donate to a UK charity, but the recipient charity does need to think about what the law expects. Now, the Charity Commission here will expect you to apply its Know Your Donor framework, which can mean more onerous requirements for gifts from some jurisdictions. I think it's also worth saying that the tax treatment of those donations will depend on the donor's tax position and the relationship between their country of tax residence and the UK. Can donors who are UK resident but not UK citizens donate? Well, yes, they can. And here you can claim gift aid, provided the donor has UK source income and pays enough UK tax. But there may be consequences to think about in the jurisdiction where the donor is a citizen. Jane mentioned dual qualified charities earlier, and I think it's worth just considering the position of US citizens resident in the UK. Now here, a donation to a UK charity would reduce their UK tax bill, but could actually increase their US tax bill. It's possible to deal with this by giving through a structure that involves dual qualified status. And this is in sort of very brief legal terms. You usually have a US parent organization with a subsidiary charitable company limited by shares here in the US. And this allows the US citizen donor who's resident in the UK to give in a tax efficient way. Now, some large scale donors like to set up their own dual qualified structures. Those involve quite extensive setup costs and they can be expensive to run. So this certainly isn't for everybody. But happily, there are providers such as Chapel and York who are able to make these sorts of structures available. So what about donors who are resident elsewhere in the EU? Can they donate? Well, yes, there are no restrictions at all. But tax relief here is really complicated because we have to think about European legislation. And there's a line of judgments for the European Court of Justice about cross-border gifts. I'm not going to take you through that in detail. You'll probably be relieved to hear. But the upshot of all of those legal judgments is that EU member states, while they can apply slightly different rules to their own taxpayers, they can't do that if those differences amount to what the European Court calls a disguised restriction on the free movement of capital. Now, in reality, this is an issue for most European Union member states. There are some that are slightly different. Sweden, for example, doesn't give any tax relief on cash gifts to charity, as far as I know. But otherwise, it is necessary for EU member states to comply with this rule. Has that actually happened? Well, yes, on paper. Here in the UK, we have legislation that allows European charities to claim tax reliefs in the UK, and it also allows donors resident in the UK to claim UK tax relief on donations made to charities in those states. But in practice, our revenue has been resistant to accepting European charities at face value. I had to do some digging around on this a couple of years ago, and I found that HMRC had accepted fewer than 50 non-UK charities, and that was only a couple of years ago, with some really small sums of gift aid having been permitted. And the UK isn't alone here. You know, we're not the worst in the class by any means, because while in theory EU member states authorities should be allowing cross-border gifts within the European Union, in practice this just doesn't always work. Some are the head of the class. The Netherlands and Luxembourg are more willing to recognise non-domestic European charities, but I think a lot of countries have complied with the European Court judgment in name only. So are there any solutions to this European conundrum? Well, yes, there are, in fact. And Jane mentioned earlier the King Baudouin Foundation. They run a scheme called Transnational Giving Europe, which allows donors to give and European charities to receive through a network of institutions. And of course, Chapel and York also provide a family of foundations through which donations can be made in a tax efficient way. So there are some schemes that permit this. Now, will the law change following Brexit? That might be something that you're thinking about. The answer, I'm afraid, as far as the UK legislation is concerned, is that we just don't know. Our legislation was introduced as a result of a European Court judgment, and the European Court of Justice won't have any jurisdiction in the UK following the end of the transition period. But where this is going to leave European charities that claim UK tax reliefs and UK charities that claim tax relief in other European countries, I'm afraid, is for the time being anyone's guess. The good news is that both Chapel and York and Transnational Giving Europe offer structures that should be able to survive any form of post-Brexit settlement. And can non-EU and non-US residents donate to a UK charity? Well, yes, they can, but probably not in a tax-efficient way, other than where Nancy can provide a solution. So that's the income side. What about the expenditure side? Can a UK charity work and make grants anywhere in the world? Yes, it can, but you do have to think about the tax rules here, because if you spend funds outside the UK and you don't take what HMRC regards as reasonable steps to ensure that the funds are applied for charitable purposes under English law, there can be a hefty tax bill and also potentially liability for the trustees. Now, in practice, the way to get around this is by doing the sorts of things that most charities do as a matter of course: due diligence in the overseas organisation you're funding, binding terms and conditions of grant allowing clawback of funds, and ongoing monitoring. They're all sort of sensible, good practice. But I think it's also worth remembering that there might be implications in the recipient organisation's country as well. In the last decade, we've seen new legislation in jurisdictions as diverse as Russia and India that make it more difficult for non-profits that receive their funds from overseas. So I think you do need to think quite carefully about restrictions in the recipient country as well as where funds are being raised. It's also, of course, worth thinking about the important question here, which is, should the tax deductibility to the donor of any gift be the determining factor for you deciding to set up a UK charity? Well, not necessarily, because it may be that you can raise sufficient funds from the UK from donors who are not that concerned about tax relief. Attitudes to tax relief do vary, and some donors are more concerned about this than others. But of course, this might be an important factor when you think about developing your fundraising strategy. If you do have a lot of UK donors, then setting up a UK charity as part of an international structure is certainly possible. The UK entity will need to operate sufficiently independently to be recognised as a charity by the Charity Commission. And really what that means is that its trustees will need to have some discretion over how funds are spent. It's absolutely not impossible to achieve this, but it does require a little bit of thought. It involves identifying some UK board members and then establishing a UK structure and getting that registered with the Charity Commission and HMRC. But this can be a costly exercise, and I suppose it isn't going to be the right solution for charities that are seeking to raise smaller amounts of money from the UK, where other sorts of structure, some of the conduit facilities and international giving structures that I've mentioned, might offer a better solution. I'm now going to hand back to Nancy.
Thank you, James. That's so helpful and so interesting. I think one of the other things that we've come across recently is that that UK charities can be themselves registered in places like the Middle East, Dubai, and directly in Hong Kong without needing to set up a separate charity, which is an interesting result of the colonial system from a very long time ago. But thank you very much for that. I've been tasked, everyone, with talking about the rest of the world, not because either I'm an expert in every other country, or that we value every other country less than the US and the UK, but mostly because in most countries around the world, there are no tax benefits for funds that leave the country. Mostly, they are available for domestic charities that benefit the domestic country. There are a few, So the Chapel and York Foundations, for example, are in countries that do have tax benefits for donations that then can benefit things outside the country. So the Netherlands, for example, Switzerland, Hong Kong, but Singapore it has very generous tax benefits for donations, but only for those that benefit the Singaporean community, which makes it more challenging if you want the funds to come somewhere else. And you're sort of either limited to those organizations that actually operate in Singapore, or those that that have a very specific Singaporean nexus. Some countries, such as Australia, have absolutely no tax benefits. We've all been trying for years, particularly New Zealand universities, to see if the Australian government would allow tax deductions, and so far no one has cracked that. So there are tax benefits out there. Generally, most of the countries, they are limited to local organizations. And for those that do have benefits when funds go abroad, almost all of them mean you have to give to a local charity, and then that local charity can benefit charities abroad. Canada is very interesting because Canada really requires the local charity to be even more involved with the foreign charity than just making grants. So it's very fascinating how countries in the world have looked at how they allow tax benefits to be used and what sort of restrictions that they put on them. I guess I would say that one of the crucial things is to talk to your donors. If the donor has questions, you just need to engage with them. The more money they have, the more they will have tax advisors already, usually. And there are some very incredibly brilliant tax people that work with international donors and international charities, two of whom you've just heard from. And so that can help you with that sort of thing. I would highly encourage you all to join the Chapel and York Connect app, which will be a great way to interact both with speakers on this session as well as others, to ensure that you can get answers to specific questions when and if you need them. But let me ask our speakers a couple of questions, if I may. The first one is, have you seen any changes in the legal structures or working with charities due to COVID? It's got to be something we're all thinking about. Has there been any effects that you've seen in your countries?
Here in the US, I'm seeing some drawing in, and so there are more grants for social services to address hunger and homelessness. We've got COVID going, and we also have a government that has not provided a second COVID relief bill. And so there's so much going on domestically that several of my donors who were funding abroad are saying during this period, we're keeping the money here. There's so much need here.
Is there anything that's either helped donors, changes in the law, changes in tax deductions that's been happening, or anything, again, others that are looking to America, recognizing that probably everywhere in the world there's been some issues of people looking more locally, but has there been anything else that you'd like to draw to their attention?
We have two opportunities that we don't normally have. One is that, at least for this year, a gift of cash to a public charity can be deducted for income tax purposes up to as much as might offset the donor's entire annual income. The general rule has been, under our more recent Tax Act, 60% deduction for a public charity if the gift is cash, which also is relatively new. And the last thing we have that a lot of our older donors are using is they are required to take certain distributions from retirement plans that were funded with pre-tax dollars. And of course, the wealthy clients don't need that income. So we now have a benefit where they can roll directly from their retirement plan to a charity, no deduction, but it counts toward their required annual distribution.
Can I ask the question, are you only allowed to take a tax deduction for gifts of cash, or do you get tax deductions for other things. And I also wondered if you could just give us 2 or 3 minutes about planned giving, because people do outside of America hear about planned giving, and I think it would be useful if they knew exactly what it was in the American context.
Right, of course. No, one can make a gift of almost anything to charity. There are varying rules. The best tax benefits are for gifts of publicly traded stocks and bonds and cash. Gifts of real estate are very popular here. You can even do gifts of interests in family businesses and then have the business redeem the stock, buy the charity out in essence. But it can be very useful for families that do have businesses. So planned giving encompasses many different strategies for charitable giving. But usually this is a gift that will take place at some future time, and thus we say it's planned. The simplest is for someone simply to leave a gift to charity under their will. If it's a foreign charity, and that charity is the equivalent of a US public charity, there is a federal estate tax exemption, unlimited. So we don't have, you can leave as much as you want if it's the right kind of foreign charity. We then have certain kinds of charitable trusts that can be quite popular. One is set up by the donor, makes payments to the donor for life, donor's spouse perhaps, and then at the end of the day goes to a charity. And that unfortunately must be a US charity, but it could be to one of these feeders or friends of organizations, and then flow out to a foreign organization. There is another kind of trust that's very popular now, which is makes payments to a charity for a period of years or for someone's life, and then at the end of the day either goes down to children and grandchildren or can revert to the donor. And all of these are things that might be looked at when the donor who is making the gift has had a spike in income that year and needs a deduction to offset his tax on that profit or additional income.
Thank you. So that's the charitable remainder trusts and the charitable lead trusts that people may have heard about.
Exactly, that's the terminology.
Super.
And we do a lot of them.
Yeah. And I've always thought that people, if they really want to know about them, if they go look at one of the big US institutions, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, etc., they can actually read a lot about those and things like that. And it's because they're very useful, aren't they, in your context? And James,
Yes.
does the UK have the same sort of system?
Well, there are some similarities, but we're not quite as generous. So we do have recognition in our inheritance tax regime for gifts to charities. A little bit like in the US, there is a restriction to UK entities. Now there are ways to get around that. If a gift is left to an overseas charity, there is a period of time in which you can execute a deed of variation to sort of pass that gift over to a UK eligible organisation. We also have an interesting option that was introduced a few years ago that means that you can reduce the rate of inheritance tax that a donor pays if they leave 10% or more of their estate to a charity. So I think that's also quite an interesting option that some charities here have been publicising. What we don't have, although there have been campaigns for it, is something equivalent to the charitable remainder trusts regime in the US. There has been a campaign, a long-standing campaign to introduce these here, but to date, unfortunately, that hasn't yielded success.
James, is the gift aid regime applicable to all kinds of gifts? So can it be gifts of property or shares or stock or anything like that, or is it limited to cash?
It isn't limited to cash, but when you step outside of cash, there are some important restrictions. So gifts of land, to be eligible, it has to be UK land, which sometimes surprises international donors. for gifts of shares, they have to be of certain listed shares. So again, there's often an issue in practice there, and certain kinds of asset are outside the regime altogether. I once had a client who wanted to make a gift of a classic car collection, but unfortunately there's no recognition for that in the tax system.
I think our best gift that we managed to work with was a US person who wanted to give an aeroplane to a museum in London, which was quite fun. It wouldn't fit in the office, so we had to get it flown directly there.
I mean, the other thing to say there, Nancy, of course, is that UK charities can accept gifts of all kinds. They can accept the yacht or the classic car collection if they want. It's just that we don't have provision for that in our tax system.
I suppose the final question I would like to ask you both is, what is the one thing that fundraisers should take away from this session? That will help them with their international fundraising? What is the one thing that you want to leave them with from your particular point of view and your vast experience?
Yes, I'm sorry to give such a lawyer's answer to this question, Nancy, but I think the most important thing is really to do your research and find out the way that different countries' legal and tax systems work together, or unfortunately more often than not work against each other, because this is complicated. And it does involve planning ahead. If you need to raise funds from the UK, a lot of things are possible, but they can take time to put in place. And as I'm sure Jane would say, from a US perspective, regulators can move frustratingly slowly. I think also I would say not necessarily to rush to the most comprehensive solution, because there may be workarounds that will save you time and money and might actually be a better fit for what you're trying to achieve.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Jane?
Interesting, all of the similarities between the US and the UK systems. I would say, yes, you're absolutely right, James, that the IRS is very focused on grants for use abroad. And so expect that the US charity is going to do quite a bit of due diligence. You might be wondering why they need so much information, but it's absolutely critical for them. I should mention, and this isn't direct to your question, Nancy, but we do have very favorable treaties with Canada, Mexico, and Israel that can be helpful if you're in one of those jurisdictions. And I would say expect that the US charity is going to want to remain involved and monitor your use of the funds, unless you're a very well-known large charity. There's a very big focus on assessing risk and taking practical steps to minimize risk that the funds will not be used for the purpose for which they were granted.
And interestingly, on that basis, of course, most countries do have some sort of terrorist list or register that needs to be consulted when you're doing a know your donor. Most countries now have know your donor policies because you know, the financial risks, reputational risks are so huge. And so in some respects, there's more that unites us than divides us in the world of charities. I guess for my own part, we've been doing this, setting up charities and running things for the last 23 plus years. And the one thing that I would say is that our focus has shifted quite a lot. My thinking has shifted quite a lot. We started out setting up 501c3s in America, setting up charities in the UK, and setting up charities elsewhere around the world. And increasingly, I think for those organizations that really want to just fundraise, setting up a separate legal entity really needs to be thought through a lot. Because as both James and Jane has said about their countries, and it's true, I mean, a Section 88 charity in Hong Kong, Singapore requires a two-step charity system. Some are easier, but even so, it just means that you're having to work with the board, You're having to work with a regulatory regime that you're not going to be familiar with. And some, of course, fundraisers aren't even very familiar with their own regulatory regimes because they don't need to be. There's a whole lot of staff that deal with just that. So it means working in other countries and trying to figure out what you're doing running a charity there. And increasingly, I would just say that unless you absolutely have a brilliant reason to do it, that you look very carefully. The cost of setting up and managing these things has gone up. So I think my point with this is it's perfectly possible to set up entities in countries, but even more so, look to see what else is available before you decide to do so. I just today got an email from somebody who did, after all my saying, don't do it, said for them, it is the right thing for them to set up something in the country that they're looking at, but to be very careful because it's not rocket science. We do it all the time, all of us, but it just has to be right for your organization so that there is no reputational risk, there's no financial risk. And the point of it is, what does your donors need from you in that country? Is having an entity the right answer to that, or is there something else because you want to be successful abroad? And tax and legal, whilst they're important, doesn't and shouldn't run what you're trying to do. So I think unless anyone has any last words, James?
No, I don't think so. Safe to say thank you very much for inviting me, Nancy, and it's been great to share this session with you and with Jane.
James, thank you so very much. Jane?
Thank you both. And James, I learned from you today. So thank you for your
As I did from you, Jane. Thank you.
And me from both of you. So thank you all very much. For those of you that are watching, we hope that this has been something that has been useful. Do feel free to be in touch with us or with anyone else that is on the app, the Chapel New York Connect app. And we hope that you've enjoyed this part of IFAB. So thank you all very much for participating and for being here and for watching.